So there's been a lot of conversation, particularly in this town recently, about fiscal cliffs. And there's this notion with a fiscal cliff that you're somehow at the top and you're peering down, about to head into some abyss. And what I'd like to introduce is a new metaphor here, which is the recovery cliff. But this time you're at the bottom and you're looking up and you're trying to think about, how do I scale back up to that cliff and what does it take? So if the fiscal cliff is the pre-event, the recovery cliff is after the event and you're trying to get back up. A lot of the work that we do at our center is looking at the impact of disasters on people, on communities, on populations, on vulnerable groups. And we've done a lot of this examination where we keep on finding pretty much the same story, told again and again. Despite the lessons learned, you keep on seeing the same kind of problems that people face, and they often find themselves in very similar circumstances at the bottom of a cliff, whether they're in Louisiana, in Mississippi, or they're in the Rockaways, Breezy Point, or Staten Island. They're facing that same cliff. Lori has been, in fact, a terrific partner for us because, in part, she gave us an opportunity to take a step back from some of the work that we do looking at the impacts on populations and to begin to ask a couple of different questions. She allowed us to ask a question: how do mid-sized U.S. cities prepare for long-term recovery before the disaster even occurs? And it gave us a chance to visit a couple of cities around the country and talk to people who are in harm's way but have not experienced a disaster to find out what are they doing to prepare for that eventuality. The answer, by the way, is not a whole lot. That's probably not a surprise to anybody. Then after this, she also gave us funding to ask the question, and what is the role and what are the evolving trends for disaster philanthropy? What is the space that disaster philanthropy can fill? What are the gaps? What is needed? And as any good academic, I've left you a little handout. So you have a one page in front of you, which has 7 key trends that I'd like to at least mention and bring to your attention. And we wrote this before Hurricane Sandy, and when I read this over, I'm thinking this is exactly what we're seeing yet again. So trend number 1 is that there will be less federal money to support recovery than in prior years, and we've already begun to see this play out. We've watched the negotiations between the governors of the states, the federal government, the administration over how much money would be available. How much will be for restoration? How much would go to mitigation? Is mitigation an important part of recovery or not? These all have implications for philanthropy, by the way. Number 2, recovery is becoming more of a professional discipline, and that's a good thing. There's a National Disaster Recovery Framework, which we may touch upon, and it means that there are a lot of people who think of recovery in some ways as disaster recovery as a life's work, a thing to do, a profession. It becomes a bit of a bureaucracy, though. And with bureaucracies come rules and restrictions and limitations and lack of innovation. And again, there could be a role for philanthropy to come in and break log jams. Number 3, there has been a huge shift in who holds the risk. Where's that catastrophic risk? Where's the insurance coverage? And in fact, there have been huge shifts away from people being able to adequately protect themselves with appropriate insurance for a variety of structural reasons and probably psychological ones as well. And so what this means is communities are much more uncovered or at risk than they had really thought they were. And this has an implication after an event like Sandy, and now you go to look to see, well, how much risk did we manage to capture? How much did we cover? And the answer is not as much as you thought. Number 4, the infrastructure, the critical infrastructure in this country is decaying and is a time bomb. And this is something that every couple of years the American Society for Civil Engineers grade how well we're doing as a country, and the grades range from D+ to C- on our critical infrastructure. And they said it would take about, I think the last estimate was $2.2 trillion to address and fix the critical infrastructure problems we have. And when you look at some of the problems that emerged in Hurricane Sandy in a couple of the hospitals, I think it was immediately evident what happens when you have not just decaying infrastructure, but you haven't put enough thought or planning into what could happen when a disaster occurs and the cascading events that you don't always think about. And this is clearly related to the decaying infrastructure as well. Number 5, communities don't really understand the risks that they're exposed to. This gets to a little bit of the mitigation problem too. It gets to a climate change question in some ways. Are people really thinking about the true risks that they face in their community? I mean, in New York City, we kind of forgot that we're actually a port city. I think we had a sobering reminder, I'm from New York, that that is exactly what we are. Nobody expected the storm to come up and make a left, but it happens. And we're sitting there, and I mean, for the last several years, I've seen model after model that shows this is what a Category 2 and 3 hurricane will look like in downtown Manhattan. You will have a cascading wave that could be 20 to 30 feet high going from the Battery down. And people would look at that and go, that'll never happen. I don't think they're going to look at those models again in the same way. We only had a tropical storm this time. It wasn't even a Category 1 by the time it made landfall. Number 6, and this is a really critical one for disaster philanthropy. There's a very short window of opportunity after the disaster occurs. There's that moment. I have colleagues who have sort of termed this the conundrum of speed versus deliberation. There's an urge for speed after a disaster occurs. The urge to immediately rebuild, restore, put things back to the way they were. At the same time, it is an unbelievable moment and opportunity to be a little bit deliberative and say, is there something better that we could be doing for the community? Is there a way we could structure our discussions about redevelopment and sustainable redevelopment that would allow us to build back so we're not at such risk and so that we actually accomplish things that we might not have otherwise thought about and make ourselves a better community? And then lastly, I think that the point is that we have not really experienced a mega disaster in this country other than Hurricane Katrina. So notwithstanding the governor of my state saying that, you know, Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy was, you know, as monumental as Katrina, in some ways economically perhaps it did have a huge footprint. There was no question about it. But it didn't have quite the scale, the magnitude, and the human suffering of a Katrina. It doesn't mean that we're not at risk for that. We clearly are at risk for that type of an event. And these are all things that hopefully we'll have a chance, and I'll have a chance to reflect upon, where disaster philanthropy can fit in to all of these elements and begin to play a role.